Okay, so to begin, thank you, Jim, for organizing this presentation, and thank you, Olivia, for organizing the Zoom portion of the presentation. This is going to be on the creation of a garden over the last 18 years, which has been carved out of a cornfield in the rolling hills of the southern Berkshire Mountains on a 41-acre parcel of land, which was purchased in 2002. And by way of introduction, I am an architect, not a landscape architect, but in this garden, I played both roles of architect as well as garden designer. And by way of introduction, I thought it might be interesting or even important to talk about some of the forces that have acted on my architectural education. So I'm going to run through a few currents in architectural and landscape architectural design over the last 20 or 30 years, very briefly. So the first, and each of these three sort of forums or approaches to architecture have a basis in historical relevance and sort of commentary on historic and architectural forms from the past. So the first movement was deconstructivism, which has an approach to historicism in contrast to the historic structure. So what I was describing was these three currents in architectural discourse at the time of my architectural education, which the first being deconstructivism. These are a couple of examples of it. It's a fairly violent approach to historical architecture, meaning interventions are sort of violently integrated into the structures. The second movement was postmodernism. And by the way, my education was from 1976 to 1984. The second movement was really postmodernism with the caryatids from the Erechtheum, the Temple of Athena, and the Acropolis as one inspiration, which then devolved or evolved into the same image at Disney of the caryatids being the seven dwarfs. So it's a take on historical architecture, but sort of commentary and a little bit, let's say, flippant approach to it. The third movement was something called critical regionalism, which was architects working in regions around the world, very much committed and tied to their architectural legacy and the context in which they were working, with a few proponents, including Alvar Aalto in Finland, Alvaro Siza in Portugal, Tadao Ando in Japan, and with, for example, this memorial garden on the right, which really could only exist in Japan. It's exquisite. So where I was talking about critical regionalism, which is that third movement in architecture, really. So I'd gone through Tadao Ando's work with this memorial garden on the right-hand side, and very much tied to the history of Japanese architecture and garden design. And then probably one of the most influential architects in my training was Erik Gunnar Asplund in Sweden. And he designed this crematorium outside of Stockholm, where he molded the landscape in the approach to the crematorium, including this really beautiful private space on the right-hand side on this hill that there's a passage that's carved out into it, giving entrance to it. He was very influential in my architectural training. These are a couple of other views of the crematorium entrance and the landscape surrounding it. Gunnar Asplund also designed the Stockholm Public Library, along with a number of other buildings. And part of what was important to me about that building was the idea of symbolism being used in architecture and landscape. And in this case, the door handles to enter the world of the mind, which is the library, are sculptures of Adam and Eve, which one has to touch or grab. So the idea of the flesh contrasting with the realm of the mind. And every time someone comes into the building, they have to go through this sort of acquaintance with the body as well as the mind. So that was an important aspect of my background. I've spent a fair amount of time in Italy, including a fair amount of time at the American Academy in Rome. And there are a number of architects and architectural landscape designs that are very sort of pivotal and were very influential in my design of my own house and garden. The Villa Lante in Viterbo with the two, and by the way, at the Academy in Rome, I studied the integration of landscape architecture and architecture. And so the Villa Lante is a perfect example of that, with the two Cassini occupying a preeminent place within the garden, and the notion that the garden begins at the top of the hill with sort of this primordial ooze coming out of, represented by water, and then cascading down the hill and ending in a very sort of formal parterre garden. So the range from very organic, primitive world to a very organized geometric world was again very influential in my design. Another image of the Villa Lante. The Villa Farnese in Caprarola, also by Vignola, was also instrumental or influential in the integration of architecture and landscape design. The main entrance is up this cascading stair ramp area with a water feature running down the center of it. It's very dramatically set on top of a hill overlooking the hills around the Turbo. And the last Italian garden that's been very influential is Villa Gambarea, which is about halfway between Florence and Fiesole, outside of, to the north of Florence. Influential in that it sort of introduced this notion of controlled views and height within gardens. So the entrance is down this long sort of cavernous arcade of vegetation, evergreen vegetation, and then giving over to a fairly formal landscape with controlled views out to the city of Florence, and a number of sort of punctuation points of verticality, which emphasize the contrast between the horizontal nature of this large platform and the vertical natures of these elements. So very influential. Yeah, another.
One thing, Larry, could I just ask, what are the approximate dates on those gardens?
They're all Italian Renaissance gardens from the 1700s.
We'll save the rest of the questions till the end.
Oh, okay.
Fernando Caruncho in Spain has also been a wildly influential architect or landscape designer in my life. Sort of mixing, again, verticality. In Spain, there are cypresses against olive trees, and this sort of monoculture of plant material as an understory to these vertical elements, and the contrast between the olive trees and the cypress giving that verticality. So a very simple palette of materials, very broad textures, and clearly man-made, but somehow feeling fairly natural. The lower image is a larger image of that same garden. And then he's also done a series of water gardens, which an image is up on the top. The next very influential landscape designer that you're probably all familiar with is Piet Oudolf, a Dutch landscape designer who really sort of transformed the world of landscape architecture and landscape design by really creating gardens built around native species, four-season gardens, verticality, strong geometries, large palette of plant material, but used in a fairly large scale. So single plant materials spread out over large areas. This is a garden he did in England. And he's, again, well known for sort of pushing the notion of native plants, four-season gardens, and structural integration of architectural and landscape elements in gardens. So, so that's by way of sort of introduction to me as a landscape designer and architect. So the new garden, which again is on this 41-acre site, was started in 2002. And I've always liked this quote: a garden is always a series of losses set against a few triumphs, like life itself. And I think we all, as gardeners, can appreciate that. So setting out to design this garden, I set myself a few challenges. One was creating a garden that was very much tied to the landscape, tied to the architectural context, tied to the scale of the land and the surrounding fields and the long distance views. And then in all of my architecture, I really work on the notion of introducing ideas of memory and elements from one's past that inform the architecture, and in this case, the landscape architecture, which I will explain as I move through it. So in 2001, we were driving up this hill and saw a for sale sign in Millerton, New York, and saw from the road that there was this long distance view to dairy farms to the south and views to the west and the east, which were, because the land was covered in corn, and the corn was, this was in September or October, the corn was about 7 feet tall. We actually went back to the house, which we had in Sharon, Connecticut, which is right over the border, and brought back a ladder, which I stood, and this is an image of me standing on the ladder and seeing what the views might be from this land. And it was in very short order that we ended up selling the house in Sharon, buying this land, and starting this new adventure of the garden in Millerton. The land is in what's called the Coleman Station Historic District. And this historic district is really made up of a series of dairy farms, which supplied a lot of the milk to New York City. And there was a train that ran from New York City, Grand Central, up to Coleman Station, which the milk would be placed in train cars and delivered back to New York City. But there was sort of an unspoken and spoken restriction on what could be built. Most of the houses are from the 1700s and some from the early 1800s. and they are largely center hall colonial houses, fairly traditional. This is one example from the late 1700s near my house. So it was sort of said that the house could either be a center hall colonial or a barn structure, of which there are a number of structures nearby. And these are some examples of them very close to the property. This one being the most relevant to the design of my house. So in deciding between a center hall colonial and a barn, I selected to go with a barn structure, but the intention was to make it in terms of critical regionalism of sort of modern interpretation of a barn on this rolling set of hills and property. So this is a site plan of the property, the 41 acres, indicating the long distance views to the south and to the west, which are to dairy barns and meadows. A lake view, which is a more intimate view to the east, and Indian Mountain, which is a double humped hill fairly close by. And the other element is it is set on a hill, and the winds, the northwest winter winds, are fierce. And so one of the first things I did was introduce a windbreak, which is set to the northwest to control the amount of buffeting from the winds that the house receives. There's also an orchard that was planted close to the road along the entrance drive, which I'll show in a few moments. So this is the long distance view to the south and to that dairy farm with the hills set behind it, the southern Berkshire Hills. Another view of it, it's often shrouded in fog in the mornings. And this is a view to the west, which is of the ridgeline of the hills, and then these cut fields within the hill. This was taken just last weekend, so it's a sort of fall winter view. This is the early spring view, where it's very green and lush. And then this is the eastern view, which is of Indian Mountain and Indian Lake at the foot of the hill. And the property goes down to Indian Lake. So this is East Light. Another view of that cut field to the east. And so the house is organized really around the garden, and it is based on the barn structures nearby, which are mostly on a north-south axis to capture the southwest summer winds for cooling, and buffeted from the northwest winds by, again, a windbreak. And then there are a series of outbuildings. So this is the overall landscape plan of the property. The gardens represent about a little more than 1/4 of an acre of land, and they surround the house and the outbuildings. There are 8 doors from the house to the outside, each one leading to a different garden and garden variety. This is an early 3-dimensional view of the house and that part of the garden surrounding the house. And as I said, so part of critical regionalism is incorporating elements from the architectural culture of the place. And most of the houses surrounding it, within the Coleman Station landscape, have as their heart an original timber frame. And then over the years, there have been a series of accretions, expanding in all directions. But there's really at the heart there's usually a 1 or 2 room timber element that was the original structure. So I wanted to sort of recreate that notion, and so the first element that was built was a reclaimed timber frame from an old barn, and then the house grew around it and absorbed that timber frame. It acts as the entrance and the dining room to the garden, and this is it going up early on in the construction. So it's a nod to the history of the region. It's the first thing one sees when one enters the house, and it occupies the dining space. During construction, there were many animals that came to the site, including the local farmers' cows that visited frequently. They seemed to get out of their fenced-in area quite often. So there was a great deal of humor when they would arrive. So here are a couple of images of the house shortly before it's finished. And you can see the sort of barn-like forms, the sort of abstract notion of a silo, which is the tower element housing the stair, and then a series of outbuildings, guest house on the left and a small greenhouse on the right. A number of other images of it under construction, beginning to see the stonework formed at the entrance, and then stone walls surrounding and describing certain gardens that were to be established. This is a sort of finished view of the garden as established from an aerial drone. And as I mentioned, the orchard was planted early on, and it's all of the trees on the site that were moved were from an abandoned nursery across the road. The apple trees were from an orchard that was being dismantled. So they were 25 to 30-year-old apple trees. And they were basically given away, but I pay for the cost of moving them. So I moved 31 apple trees, which are of all different varieties, Honeycrisp, Galas, and a number of other varieties. And they produce tremendous numbers of apples. And it's the entrance point to the property at this point. The house, this is the south end of the house, and it lifts up towards the southwest to let in more light during the winter. There's a sunscreen that screens the light from the harsh summer sun. And I always described it as sort of Marilyn Monroe's skirt, which is the image on the left side. More evident when you're on the inside looking out. And this is another view of that south part of the living room element. Now I'm going to walk you through the gardens, starting with the entrance garden, which is as one comes around the drive to a parking area. It's the area shaded in green on the screen. So this is shortly after construction was completed and before the garden was introduced. And again, this notion of introducing a large scale plant material seemed relevant to the entrance part of the garden, drawing on some of the landscape architects that already described. And there was a walkway that I actually built myself, which extended from the front door out to the view to the east to the Indian Lake. This is the opposite view towards the house. And the garden was really established using Verbena bonancearis and grass called the Samsia cespitosa Schottland. as sort of a big swath of garden. And it's what greets one as one comes into the property. So a series of views of that mix of garden plant material. And the monarch butterflies love verbena. And the garden is really designed with the notion of plant materials that attract bugs, insects, bees, pollinators, hummingbirds, butterflies, and a tremendous number of species of bird life. So another view of the verbena, which isn't annual, but it self-seeds every year. So it's only mildly supplemented each season now that it's been established. And it actually appears everywhere in the garden at this point. So I'm constantly pulling it out where it's not wanted. Against the stone wall, it's a sort of quieter garden of echinacea, coneflowers, and then some mix of grasses, Amsonia, Tradescantia, and a series of other plant materials, including some box. The next garden is really the entrance court, which is what one arrives at when come from the parking area down the path that I built up to the main entrance door. And the disposition of the buildings and this courtyard, again, using that idea of memory and metaphor, it recalls a garden, a property that my grandparents had, and the way the buildings are just placed, including barns and a small greenhouse. The stonework at the entrance is based on the historic idea of these kilns, which are dotted around the landscape near my property. They were for iron working, and the stonework, stone is actually from a quarry that goes back to the 1700s in Canaan, Connecticut. And the way the stone is fitted is very similar to the kilns, one of which is shown on the left image. And then more recent introduction of a water feature at the entrance to have a little bit of element of sound as one comes up to the front door, and then a series of potted plants that are placed around that element, and evergreen vine that is now taken over the stone wall, part of the stone wall. The entrance, so this is coming up that path towards the main entrance, and one sees through the house to that cut field on the west, and really dominated by these two concrete planters, which I have fun planting every year with canna or banana trees. So they are my one nod to non-native species, but sort of fun. And those planters are watered from the skylight above the entrance, which then drains onto the canopy over the front door, which then drains out to each of those two pots. The rest of the rainwater is collected through gutters and leaders into a cistern, which feeds the irrigation system, which is an underground drip system throughout the garden. But this one entrance nod to recycling is sort of prominent. And yeah, it's a sort of image of the inside of the stone wall, and again, idea of a memory. So the light switches in the stone wall, again, recall the light switches in my grandparents' house, which were these pearl buttoned switches. And so there are elements like that throughout the property, and including in the garden and in the house. This is another view of that entrance, looking out to the east, to Indian Mountain and to Indian Lake down below. Underplanted, the Sergeant Crab is underplanted with blue star juniper. The DeGroote spires, which are the two vertical elements on either side of the path, have now more than doubled in size. This is a fairly early photograph. And then vinca is also planted on the edge of the greenhouse to the left. The next garden is what we call the hidden garden, which is through an opening in the stone wall, a very narrow opening, very vertical element, and it leads to a south-facing garden, which benefits from tremendous sunlight and is, we are generally zone 5, but this garden is zone 6, sometimes even zone 7. So I have fun with a wider palette of plant material in this garden. So this is the garden that's being established with me watering the garden beds. And then at the bottom on the right is shortly after moving in, the garden as sort of established. And this is it today, where the Tudors have hyacinth bean, and it's a mix of tropical plants as well as annuals. The coleus in the background is planted every year. Another view of that garden. It's a sort of wild mix of plant material, and sort of it's my one exuberant, sort of non-linear garden element within the garden. The next garden is sort of the largest perennial and grass garden bed, and I wanted to create a garden that is directly related to the porch, which is the element on the top of the screen, which has a view out to the pool and across this garden. And in developing a perennial garden, I wanted basically not to develop a garden that was endless and would lose one's attention after a very brief moment. So a couple of studies have been done. You can read the study on the top, but the other study is that most people's attention span lags, particularly in a gallery or art or garden setting, after about 12 or 16 feet. And so in designing this perennial grass garden bed, I use this notion of much smaller vignettes, planting beds of no more than 16 feet in dimension. And using circulation between those planting beds. These are the garden under construction, establishing the structure and the elements of the garden, and beginning of some plant material. So again, within the first season of it being planted with, again, DeGroote spires, providing the vertical element, and then lavender is the under planting, and then a Portuguese pot that was, that I purchased at a local antique shop. So you begin to see the garden beds to the right, divided into 12 and 16 foot increments. And it's a little better view again during construction of the garden, where it really looked like a wasteland. But all of these gardens have now been planted, and over the last 18 years have sort of matured to a point where this is a more current view of the garden. And these garden beds are based on a theme of color. So starting from the house, it's a white bed, then a red bed, then a blue dominated bed, and then a yellow bed. So the primary colors are used as the sort of dominant plant material. They're largely native plants, dominated by grasses, and then mixed with some perennial as well. Another view of it, the Tudors are planted with hyacinth bean, similar to what's planted in the secret garden. And then the understory is Calamagrostis, Karl Forster grass, which I love because it remains vertical, even in the harshest wind and rain. And it has interest all year round. This is an early spring view of the perennial and grass beds with a number of allium, different forms of allium that come up fairly early on in the spring. Sort of moody nighttime view of the garden from the springtime. And the view from the porch down this main axis, which is on axis with the Portuguese pot, and then across to the pool, through 2 pool buildings, and then to the last garden, which I will review or get to. Some other images of the perennial grass beds begin to see the theme of red, blue, purple, and yellow, and then these cross paths which divide up these beds into smaller elements, including gates that lead away from the garden. The fence is a requirement around the pool, 4-foot fence, so that has a gate in it. This is a view back to the house across the pool. And another view, more sort of dramatic view of with the light catching the Karl Forster grass forms. And then near the pool, at one side of the stone wall describing one of the yellow bed is a small basin, limestone French basin, which again provides a little echo or sound of water splashing near the pool area. Underplanted with ginger and fescue and euphorbia, and then some box to establish the structure. View across the pool to Rudbeckia and a series of grasses, including not a grass, but a mountain mint, which is a great complement to the Rudbeckia. And another view, again, across the pool. So grasses mixed with perennials. More recent view, late fall, after the Rudbeckia has bloomed and the grasses are coming into their own. Or aerial view from the 2nd floor window, looking out to the garden, that area. And then again, much like Villa Gambarea, the views are concealed by these European hornbeam hedges, which frame exits from the garden through what is a large gate and dominated by these 2 stone piers. Another view of the Rudbeckia Goldstrom and the grass mix. And then the next garden is the garden between the pool and the 2 pool houses. One pool house has the electrical and solar panel equipment, and the other is designed as a sculpture studio and is now used as a study, the one on the left. So this is, again, a very early view and a winter view of that garden between the pool and the pool houses. This is the view taken by Martha Stewart Living for when it was published in that magazine. And you may have noticed that the Tudors with the stainless steel balls on top have been removed, which was Martha Stewart's edit to the garden imagery. So I didn't have much of a say in that, but that's what was done. So these two planting beds are dominated by Rudbeckia nitida and a number of other grasses, and then the understory is Nepida, form of Nepida. Another view of those gardens and a view of the Nepida with allium. This is early spring view. Allium, it's called Summer Drummer, which is one of my favorite alliums. It's taller than most, and its blooms last a little longer than most allium blooms. And then planted against the pool houses is an Arctic kiwi plant on each side, which turns this beautiful white pink shade once the sun hits it over the course of the summer. Another view of garden. And the next garden, which is on the other side of the two pool buildings, is the Garden of Energy, which houses the two compost bins and the solar panels, which are designed to be part of the garden, not disguised on the roof or not disguised somewhere off from the property, but very much a part of moving through the garden down the main axis across the pool. So this is a view of the solar panels, and they provide about 2/3 of the electricity for the house over the course of the year. They overproduce during the summer, and the meter runs backwards whenever it's sunny, which is very satisfying. And then during the winter, it's somewhat the opposite. And again, the underplanting next to the solar panels is Nepida and another form of allium, again, a summer or spring view of that garden. Another view of the solar panels. I think they're beautiful in the landscape, and very happy with the color of them, the way they sit, and the path between them. The next garden is on the other axis, which is under a trellis, which provides a modest amount of shade to the pool deck area. And it's punctuated by arborvitae that leads to the last garden. So this is a view down that trellis looking to the north. And the gardens on each side are planted with a variety of phormium, which is a sort of tropical plant that is brought in each year, and as well as lamb's ear and different form of coleus and coreopsis, and series of other plants. Another view down that trellis. This is from the red perennial bed with Nadia and Monarda, various other, Joe Pieweed, and a few other red dominated plants. And another view, this is from the edge of the pool deck looking to the north, and the view at the end of the trellis and down that axis of arborvitae leads to this blue pot, which is filled with tropicals. And most years it's been banana, sometimes it's been canna, saved over the years. And the backdrop is, again, the Carl Forster, Calamagrostis, Carl Forster grass, and Giganteum is the grass in the rear. And the last garden, which connects the two primary axes of the garden, is surrounded by an arborvitae and DeGroot spire hedge. So it creates its own sort of private realm or private room within the garden as a way of ending it and a way of having it be somewhat separate from the rest of the house and the rest of the garden. It's dominated by a 40-foot rill. And I should say, maybe here is a good time to describe the entire house and the entire garden are based on a 4-by-4 foot module. So there is a grid that's overlaid on the landscape. And the notion for construction of the house on the 4-foot module was that most construction materials come in 4-foot increments. So 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of sheetrock or plywood, 12-foot framing lumber, 16-foot framing lumber, 20-foot framing lumber, with the idea that they could be ordered and then used without being cut. And so there was very little waste on the house construction. The dumpsters were mostly empty. Full sheets were used and to assemble the house. And then that grid, that module was overlaid throughout the landscape and including out to the orchard at the entrance of the garden. But this garden is dominated by the two principal axes, and then this rill, which is at the center of the axes, and a small bench area with a perennial form of bamboo, forming a small room within a room. And the dominant plant material in this garden is similar to Fernando Caruncho's work, but translated to the northeast of the US, is a combination of apple trees and DeGroot spires, which is as close as we can come to olive trees and cypress as a native species. So the rill is based on a series of inspirations, including the garden on the left, which is in England, Louis Kahn's Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, and then the Alhambra in Spain. And it's sort of a distillation of all these ideas into what I would call a sort of a more modern take on the idea of a rill garden or waterway garden. So this is an image of that garden, ending with the bamboo and the bench. The understory planting is Tradescantia and a series of varieties of hosta, as well as Liriope along the edge of the garden. And then, so this is at the center of the garden, another view of that looking the opposite way. There's a small pool at the end with a water element, again, for sound within the garden, and a couple of pots that have more tropical plants. Hyacinth plant is put in the rill each summer, and it spreads to occupy and provide some shade for the koi and the goldfish that carp that live throughout the year in the rill. It's again using the 4-foot module. It's 4 feet wide, including the stone paving. The rill itself is 1 foot wide and is 40 feet long. Another view of the rill. different time of year. Again, you can sort of see the DeGroote spires and the alternating with the apple trees. And a view down one of the paths leading to the rill with the DeGroote spires and apple trees. The underplanting is Hackney cloa, Loriope, and then form of grass which is punctuated sort of in a orderly way related to the orchard and the DeGroote spires. This is the crossing of the path, crossing of the rill. And these two blue pots, which are seen from the house at the end of the garden. A more current view. Winter view, the garden has great structure for the winter, even though the plants are, many of the perennials are cut down or seed heads remain, but the structure of the garden is still intact. And then, as I said, the animal life is robust in this area, including frogs, which seem to love the rill. And I always wait for the frogs to arrive in the spring. This year it was very late in the spring when they arrived, and they sit at the edge of the rill waiting for their dinners, I guess. And this is a late fall view of the rill. The last garden is on the return to the house from that rill garden, which is a bed of wildflowers. So very contained, planted each year, mostly annuals, some perennials, but a wildflower mix, which I order from a wildflower catalog. And this is a view looking back down that path towards the house with the wildflowers on each side of that pathway. Close up, dominated by sunflowers and other sort of annuals that are exuberant and friendly and sort of happy. And also pollinators love them, hummingbirds, butterflies. So why do we garden? I think we garden for the next generation. We garden to teach our children and grandchildren what nature is all about, what nature can do, the beauty of nature, the will to survive. And I love this Greek proverb, society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in, which I think we design gardens and plant gardens and work on gardens for the ages, not just for ourselves, but for people to visit and people to enjoy it over a longer period of time. So the house and the garden have had many friends and family visit. The person in the center is on the call, I think, Kevin. And so images of people enjoying the gardens. And then I'll finish with some sort of random images of the garden, including this, which had, when the house was finished, I planted the meadows with wildflowers. And they took and they continued to thrive. Most of them are perennial, not all, but they continue to have a showing each summer. And also planted Timothy grass, which is our native grass, in all of the meadows surrounding the house. And then some images of sort of plant combinations that I've particularly enjoyed, including the sedum and the allium, the verbena, the allium again, salvia with allium in the bottom right. And my nod to Pete Udoff is the image on the left, which is next to the garage garden, which is a combination of much of the plant material that he loves and uses. Here shown with a series of spider webs that have been spun among them. The mountain mint with the rudbeckia on the upper right, and the red perennial bed, Monarda and Nadia on the bottom right. And one of my favorite images, so it is a garden with a tremendous amount of structure, but planted with sort of abandoned with grasses that blow in the wind and sort of move past the idea of structure and sort of contrast with the structure of the garden. So this was a particularly blustery summer day, and took this image of the gardens near the green pool house, blowing in the wind, series of grasses. And that's again, the image of the overall garden and the house property. And that is the presentation. So hopefully you begin to understand a little bit of the garden and the design of the garden. And as always, these slideshow presentations are never the same as actually being in the garden and hearing the sounds and the scents of the garden. So I really welcome all of you to come visit if that makes sense. And that is the end of the presentation. So thank you very much. And I'll open up for questions.
The chat box and see if you can read some of those and answer some of the wonderful questions that came out.
I see. How do you keep those giant pots from shattering in winter? The concrete pots are indestructible. The blue pots at the end of the real garden are brought in each fall, and they're stored in the greenhouse with the plant material in them. So it's a combination. I do bring a number of pots in, but many of them remain out through the winter. Any deer pressure? Well, the deer definitely live on the property. They love the apples in the fall, but they tend to stay on their sort of established paths, and their established path seems to be, knock on wood so far, down by the lake. So they've not really intruded on the garden, and so I don't have deer fencing, and I have not really had an issue with deer. I've not been to the Uffit Garden in Baltimore County that you saw in June, apparently. So I'm not familiar with that garden. That's a question from Runa. I imagine he has help in the garden, otherwise impossible to maintain. Yes, the garden is impossible to maintain by one person. I do have a very talented English woman named Sally Hamilton who comes once a week with a helper, and they spend the day doing a lot of pruning. I do a lot of the weeding, but they do much of the pruning and maintenance of the garden. So without them, the garden would not look the way it looks. I give them a lot of credit. How do you overwinter the tropicals? The greenhouse this time of year is full, and the pool houses are also full of those tropicals. So they're brought in for the winter, and then I water them every couple weeks. What do you see as the ultimate fate of your gardens after you are gone? That is a very good question. I can't answer that because I don't really know. I would like to think it would continue and exist and people would continue enjoying it. I've had as many as 12 or 14 garden tours in any one season come through the garden. So it's sort of been discovered by a number of groups, and I would hope that would continue. Um, Did I miss some? Okay. Have I missed any? What is the approximate date of this garden? It's 2002 was when it was really started. And so 18 years ago. What is the tall yellow flowering plants? Most of the tall yellow plants are a form of rudbeckia called Nitida, which is can be as much as 8 or so feet tall by the time they bloom, and they bloom in the late fall, and their blooms last until the first frost. So I don't know if I've missed any of the questions. Maybe Olivia, if you.
There's one last one about how you decided to plant, so.
How did you decide how to plant? I decided based on height. And so moving away from the house, the planting beds grow taller and to a point where, for example, the pool is fairly enclosed with between everything from European hornbeam hedges controlling the view to the rudbeckia and some of the taller grasses. No Gertrude Jekyll stepping up from short in front of the back. I'm not sure if Gertrude Jekyll would approve of the garden, but she was also an inspiration. Great use of plant material.
How often do you bushwhack your meadows?
Once a year, which is done in the spring. The idea being that in the winter, it's a great habitat for a lot of critters and insects and birds. And so it's done in the early spring. Any other questions?
There's no issues with the fish getting through the winter?
No, the rill is deep enough. As long as it's over 20 to 21 inches in my climate, the fish can overwinter, and they have some of them. I think they grow to the size of the enclosure in which they are in. So they have grown, but they've sort of stopped growing, I guess, so that they can turn around within the 1 foot width of the rill. But some of them are quite large, 7, 8, 9 inches in length. But they've been there and happily survived for the last 18 years. They have a lot of babies. So there are quite a few. Every once in a while, a heron will descend on the rill and clean me out of most of the fish, but they seem to bounce back because there are enough places for the fish to hide so they don't get them all.
Thank you so much. I see people clapping.
Great, thank you.